The snow didn't just fall. It attacked. It came knifing down the tracks, a blizzard born on the northern plains, and it tore into every crack of the wooden station. Steam screamed from the iron beast of a train, a ghost of hot breath in the frozen air, wrapping strangers in white shrouds before vanishing. The world smelled of smoke and pine and a cold so deep it burned your lungs. And right in the middle of it all, a woman fell to her knees. Her dress was red, but a sad, faded red, soaked heavy with melting snow. A shawl was pulled tight around her head, but strands of black hair had escaped, plastered to her pale cheeks. Her name was Annalise Hartwell, but no one used it. To the people staring from the platform, she was just a story, the bride who'd been sent away. A stranger, abandoned the second she stepped off the train. Her hands, blue with cold, reached for the man standing over her. Jedediah Carver was a mountain of a man. Broad shoulders, a frame built by hard work and long miles in the saddle. A weathered duster coat swept around his boots, and his hat cast a deep shadow over eyes that held a quiet, patient sorrow. He was just there for supplies, same as always. In his arms, he held 2 loaves of bread wrapped in paper, steam rising from them like a tiny, mocking fire. He never expected to find this broken woman at his feet. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, a sound the wind almost stole. "Just a piece." Before Jed could move, a laugh cut through the air, sharp and ugly as a gunshot. Clint Maddox. He was leaning against a support beam, casual and cruel. He wore his money-like armor, a fine wool coat, a silver chain on his vest, gloves untouched by work, but his eyes were empty, filled only with the pleasure of watching someone else suffer. "Look at her," Maddox shouted, his voice booming for the whole station to hear. "Begging like a rat. Came all the way out here for a husband, and ends up on her knees in the snow. Fitting, ain't it?" A murmur went through the crowd. People looked away, not because they were kind, but because shame was contagious. The whole town had been chewing on Annalise's story for weeks. The mail-order bride promised a new life, only to be cast off the moment she arrived. A flaw in the merchandise. Jed didn't laugh. He didn't even look at Maddox. He just crouched down, the snow groaning under his weight, and placed the warm bread into Annalise's frozen hands. His glove brushed her skin, a flicker of warmth in a world of cold. Her eyes, filled with hunger and a humiliation so deep it felt like drowning, met his. She was looking for the joke, for the cruelty. But all she found was a quiet gravity, a silent understanding. "Careful, Carver," Maddox sneered, pushing himself off the beam and stalking closer. "Help a stray like that and she'll cling to you forever." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial poison. "Woman's poison, everyone knows it. A lesson in humility is what she needs." His grin was all teeth, like a wolf. "Maybe I'll be the one to teach it." Nearby, a white horse stamped its hooves, tethered in the shadows, and beside it stood a man named Wyatt Kane. His chest was bare to the winter air, his muscles tight cords. A hat cast his face in total darkness, but you could feel his gaze, fixed and unblinking. He was a drifter, a ghost who passed through town. His silence was heavier than all the crowd's whispers combined. Annalise clutched the bread to her chest like it was the last prayer she had. She could feel every eye on her, 100 tiny daggers of judgment. The shame burned hotter than the cold. Jed rose slowly to his full height. He never said a word to Maddox, but his stillness was a threat all its own. The giant cowboy just stood there, a silent mountain that refused to be moved. The train groaned, metal sighing, as if the world itself was tired of the cruelty. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The beggar, the bully, and the silent giant locked in a standoff on a frozen platform. Annalise wanted to disappear, to just melt into the snow and be forgotten. But the stranger's gift, the warmth of the bread in her hands, was an anchor. His gaze hadn't turned away. It held her. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. A tiny, fragile thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. Maddox finally spat into the snow. "You'll regret it, Carver," he muttered, then turned on his heel and strode toward the saloon, the crowd parting for him like he was a king. The show was over. The people dispersed, leaving only the steam and the silence and the bitter taste of shame in the air. Jed just tipped his hat to Annalise, a small, almost respectful gesture, and walked toward his own horse. But as he moved away, she looked down at the bread. It wasn't just food. It was a weapon, an act of defiance, a whisper that said, "You are not worthless." She held it tighter, her heart pounding, and from the shadows Wyatt Kane's voice finally broke the silence, low and measured, carried on the wind. "That bread cost more than coin, miss," he said. "Best be ready for what follows." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She whipped her head around to look at him, but his face was a mask of shadow. All she could see was the steady, unblinking darkness where his eyes should be. The snow started coming down harder, a thick white curtain falling on the world, and in that sudden blindness, a new certainty settled in her chest, heavy and cold as a tombstone. The trouble had only just begun. Morning came, but it brought no warmth. Only a pale, unforgiving light that exposed everything. The whispers started before Annalise even left the tiny shack she rented from the station master. They weren't just words. They were a living thing, curling through the cold air like smoke, poisoning everything they touched. Her name became a curse. The bride left wanting, the woman with no worth, the stray. Eyes followed her everywhere. In the saloon, men laughed over their mugs. "She'll trade anything for crumbs," one of them said, his voice loud enough to slice right through the thin walls. In the general store, women huddled together, whispering behind their gloved hands. She should have just gone back on the next train. Even the children, parroting the cruelty they heard at home, would chant her shame in the streets. Humiliation wasn't a single moment. It was the air she breathed. Maddox, of course, was the one tending the fire. He twisted the truth into a spectacle, telling anyone who'd listen that she was a gold digger, a woman full of demands who got what she deserved. Every lie he told cemented his own power and tightened the noose of shame around her neck. Jed Carver heard the whispers, but he never added his own. He knew you couldn't argue with a rumor, but the image of her, kneeling in the snow, stayed with him. He remembered the tremor in her hands and the flicker of defiance in her eyes. It was a look he recognized, a look he hadn't seen in a very long time. That night, snow tapping at the window of his small cabin miles from town, Jed stared into the fire. He knew what hunger did to a person. He knew what loneliness did. With a quiet sigh, he stood up, pulled on his heavy coat, and rode back into the storm. He didn't knock. Annalise just found it the next morning, folded neatly against her door. His coat, worn at the elbows, smelling of saddle leather and wood smoke, but heavier and warmer than anything she owned. She pressed her face into the rough fabric, a knot of something tight and painful loosening in her chest. Pride screamed at her not to take it. She was already the town beggar. She couldn't owe this man another debt. But when night fell again and the cold gnawed at her bones, she wrapped the coat around her shoulders. And for the first time in weeks, she slept without shivering. The next day, the whispers still followed her, but they sounded different now, fainter. They couldn't get through the thick wool of the coat. She saw Jed once, watching her from across the street. He just gave a slow, steady nod. No words. Never any words. Just these silent gestures. A loaf of bread left on her step. A tipped hat. Each act was a fragile thread, but together, they were starting to weave something strong between them. And Maddox noticed. He saw the way Jed's gaze would linger on her. He saw the way Annalise was starting to hold her head a little higher. Cruelty was a performance for Maddox, and Jed was stealing his audience. One evening, as Annalise passed the saloon, Maddox stepped right into her path. His smile was slick and oily. "Funny thing," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the men on the porch to hear. "How you found yourself a new savior. Wonder how long till he gets tired of your begging, too." His gloved hand shot out and brushed her wrist. It wasn't a kind touch. It was a brand. A claim. "Maybe you'd fare better with a man who knows what you're really worth." Annalise ripped her arm away, her breath catching in her throat. Fear and rage warred inside her. She stumbled back, but the smirk on his face told her the damage was done. Every man on that porch had seen it. The whispers would be a hurricane by sunrise. That night, in her shack, the candlelight trembled on the walls. She pulled Jed's coat tighter, her heart hammering. She could almost hear Maddox's laughter on the wind. But beneath it, she could also feel the memory of Jed's steady gaze, the way he gave without asking for anything in return. And a question sparked in her mind, a dangerous question she hadn't dared to ask before. Was she allowed to do more than just survive? Was she allowed to stand up? The thought terrified her more than starvation ever had. Days turned into a week. The gossip swelled, a festering wound on the town. But Annalise started to move differently. She walked with her head a little higher, her back a little straighter. It wasn't courage, not yet, but it was the seed of it. One evening their eyes met across the dusty street, and in Jed's gaze she saw something that wasn't pity. It was recognition. The kind of look that says, "I see you. I see you're still standing." That look warmed her more than the bread, more than the coat. But Maddox wouldn't let it go. In the saloon, he spun a new tale. Annalise hadn't just taken the man's charity, she'd bewitched him. She was a leech, sucking the life out of the quiet, giant cowboy. The story took root because the town wanted to believe it. It was more interesting than the simple, ugly truth. But something was shifting. Not everyone laughed as loud this time. A few men watched Maddox with a new suspicion in their eyes. Annalise felt it too. The whispers still cut her, but they didn't go as deep. It was like she was growing a thicker skin, scar tissue over the wounds. One night, another loaf of bread appeared at her door. She held it, the warmth seeping into her palms, and this time she didn't think of begging. She thought of survival. She thought of dignity, clawed back one crumb at a time. She sat by the window, watching the snow swirl in the lantern light, and she whispered it to the empty room. "I am still here." The words surprised her. They weren't weak. They were strong. Outside, in the shadows, a broad-shouldered figure watched her small window. She knew it was Jed, and the knowledge was both a comfort and a warning, because as long as he stood by her, Maddox would keep sharpening his knives, and a cold, hard truth settled over her. This fragile alliance she had with the silent cowboy was about to demand a price much higher than a loaf of bread. The snow finally began to thaw, turning the town's main street into a river of gray slush. But the cold in people's voices didn't thaw with it. Annalise was the town's favorite spectacle, and they weren't ready to let her go. She walked through town each morning wearing Jed's coat. It wasn't for comfort anymore. It was armor. The whispers got sharper when she wore it. "She's wrapped in him," someone muttered as she passed, and the words clung to her like burrs. But she just lifted her chin higher. She knew every window held a jury, and still, she walked. Jed got his share of the judgment, too. Men who used to nod at him now turned away. "You've saddled yourself with trouble, Carver." A rancher spat at him near the feed store. "That woman will drag your name through the mud." Jed never said a word back. He just met their accusations with that quiet, steady gaze. He bore their scorn the way he bore everything, with the patience of a man who knew you couldn't reason with a storm. Maddox, of course, thrived on the poison he was spreading. "A man who gives his coat to a beggar has already given her his bed," he announced to a crowded poker table. The room erupted in laughter. The story spread like a disease. Soon, Jed and Annalise weren't just two people anymore. They were a scandal, a cautionary tale. The breaking point came on a brittle afternoon. Annalise had earned a few coins doing mending work, enough for a small bag of flour. Her hands trembled as she walked into the general store, not from cold, but from the simple, heavy weight of having earned something for herself. The moment she stepped inside, the store went silent. Every customer froze. The storekeeper, Mr. Barrow, stood stiff and nervous behind his counter. Annalise forced her feet to move, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. "A pound of flour, please," she said, her voice soft as she placed the coins on the counter. Mr. Barrow looked at the coins, then at her, his face a mask of hesitation. And then Maddox's voice cut through the silence, smooth and venomous. He stepped out from behind a stack of barrels, a wide, predatory smile on his face. "Paying with Carver's charity, are we?" he drawled. "His bread one day, his coin the next. Seems you found yourself a husband after all." Ugly laughter broke out in the corners of the store. Annalise felt her face burn hot. Her throat closed up. She wanted to scream, to throw the coins in his smug face, but her body betrayed her. She could only stand there, frozen in her shame. Then another voice cut through the room, low and steady as a heartbeat. "That's enough, Maddox." Jed stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space, snow still clinging to his duster. The laughter died instantly. Jed's eyes were locked on Maddox, his calm more terrifying than any rage. "You speak another word against her," Jed said, his voice flat and cold, "and you'll regret it." The air in the store was so thick you could barely breathe. Maddox's grin wavered, just for a second. Then it came back, sharper, thinner. "Careful, Carver. Defend her too loudly, and folks will think she's already yours." Jed took one slow, deliberate step into the room. His boots were heavy on the floorboards. "Think what you want," he said, "but you will leave her be." The silence that followed was a crushing weight. Maddox, for the first time, was the one who looked away. He muttered something about wasted time and shoved past Jed, out into the street. Annalise stood there, her pulse pounding in her ears. Everyone had seen it, the confrontation, the defense, and she knew exactly how the whispers would twist it. This wasn't protection. This was proof. Proof of the scandal they all wanted to believe in. But as she picked up her bag of flour, something inside her felt different. Not strong, not yet, but steady. Like the trembling ground beneath her feet was finally starting to firm up. That night, the gossip was a flood. They said Carver was keeping her. They said she'd bewitched him. The stories grew wilder with every telling. The next morning was Sunday. The church bells rang out over the snow-covered town. Every instinct told Annalise to hide in her shack, but she didn't. She put on Jed's coat, pulled her shawl tight, and walked to church. The moment she stepped inside, she felt their eyes on her, sharp as knives. The preacher's sermon was all about sin and virtue, about women who stray and the men who fall with them. He never said her name. He didn't have to. She sat in the back pew, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. But she didn't leave. When the service ended, the congregation spilled out onto the church steps, buzzing like angry hornets. Maddox was there, of course, leaning against the rail, his smirk in place. "A coat, a loaf of bread, a public defense," he said, his voice carrying. "Carver might as well just marry the woman now." Annalise walked down the steps, her eyes on the frozen ground. And at the bottom, Jed was waiting. He didn't say anything. He just fell into step beside her, a silent guardian walking her through the gauntlet of judging eyes. The crowd seemed to part around them. For the first time, she felt the strange power of being seen with him, both shielded and condemned at the same time. As they reached the road, Maddox's voice rang out one last time, sharp as a whip. "Tell us, Carver. How long till she kneels for you, the way she did in the snow?" The words were like stones. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Annalise froze, the humiliation of that day washing over her, cold and sickening. She wanted to run, but Jed's hand brushed her elbow, a small, steadying touch. He didn't turn back. He didn't shout. He just kept walking forward, guiding her away, each step a silent refusal to give Maddox the fight he wanted. Behind them, the town's judgment roared. Annalise knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She glanced at Jed, at his hard-set jaw, and she understood. The next time Maddox came for her, words wouldn't be enough. Then the blizzard hit. A merciless wall of white that swallowed the world. Snow buried the town, rattling windows, howling like a hungry wolf. It was a night to stay inside, huddled by the fire. Annalise sat in her shack, a small loaf of bread, made from the flour she'd bought, baking over her small fire. The smell was a small promise of comfort. She knew the whispers hadn't stopped just because of the storm. They were probably louder now, trapped inside the town's homes, growing more twisted with every telling. But there was bread in the fire, and a coat on her shoulders. She clung to these small victories. A soft, certain knock came at her door. She froze. No one ever came to her door. When she opened it, the snow swirled in, and Jed was standing there. His coat was white with snow, his hat heavy with ice. He wasn't carrying anything this time. "Storm's too strong," he said, his voice rough with cold. "Your fire won't hold through the night." She stepped back, and he came inside, closing the door on the storm's fury. The tiny room seemed to shrink around his presence. He stood by the fire, the ice melting from his coat, his eyes lingering on the little loaf of bread. He didn't smile, but the hardness in his gaze softened. They ate in silence, tearing pieces from the loaf with their hands. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. In the flickering light, Annalise studied his face, the lines carved by years of hardship. His eyes weren't looking for anything from her. No pity, no judgment, just a man seeing another soul trying to survive. "They'll never let me belong here," she finally whispered. "Not after what he said." Jed tore another piece of bread and set it on the table between them. "Belonging's not theirs to grant." The words were simple, but they landed in her heart with the weight of truth. She thought of all the judging eyes, the cruel whispers, and for the first time they seemed smaller, less powerful. Measured against this quiet moment, a shared loaf of bread, a respected silence, the town's cruelty felt weak. But she also knew that every kindness from this man was like fuel on a fire. Maddox wouldn't let this go. Denied his public spectacle, he would get more creative, more vicious. The next morning, her fear came true. The storm had broken, but a new one was brewing. Maddox had spread a new rumor, the vilest one yet. He told everyone that Annalise had spent the blizzard in Jed's bed, that she had paid for his protection with her body. The town drank the poison eagerly. She heard it from a child in the street, who chanted the ugly words with a cruel, innocent smile. The shame was a physical thing, clawing at her throat. That evening, as she was coming back from the well, Wyatt Kane was there, waiting. The shirtless drifter stood by his white horse, an enigma of muscle and shadow. "Maddox is fighting a man who won't play his game," Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble. "So he's decided to burn the whole board down. He won't stop until he's made you both choke on the ashes." Annalise gripped the bucket handle. "What am I supposed to do?" Wyatt's gaze was steady, unblinking. "Decide. Are you going to keep kneeling, or are you going to stand up where the whole damn town can see you?" And then he was gone, vanishing into the twilight, leaving her with the question hanging in the frozen air. Stand up where the whole town can see you. The words echoed in her head all night. She had no weapon, nothing but a dignity that had been shredded and torn so many times she wasn't sure there was anything left. But as she thought of Maddox's smirk, a hard, cold knot of anger formed in her belly. This wasn't about belonging anymore. This was about refusing to be erased. The next day, she walked to the station, the place where it all began, and Jed was there, leaning against a post, as if he knew she would come. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken understanding. "I won't kneel again," she said, her voice low but fierce as a flame. Jed's eyes held hers. He gave the faintest nod. Then, he did something she never expected. He held out his hand. Not as a savior offering help, but as an equal, a partner. She put her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm. A silent vow passed between them. But just as the first flicker of hope warmed her chest, a crunch of boots on snow sounded behind them. Maddox's voice, slick with venom, drifted across the frozen air. "Well, what a fine sight. The fallen bride and her giant fool. You thought you could hide behind silence, Carver? Thought her shame would just burn itself out?" He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "You don't know the kind of fire I can start." Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs. Jed's hand tightened around hers, an anchor in the sudden storm. Maddox's shadow stretched long and dark across the white snow, and she knew. The battle for her soul had only just begun. The morning of the reckoning was sharp and brittle. Frost made the boardwalks glitter like they were covered in broken glass. The whole town was there, gathered at the station. They weren't there for a train. They were there for a hanging, even if the rope was made of words. Annalise walked toward them, Jed by her side. She wore his coat like a banner, her face pale but set. Her hands trembled, but her chin was high. Every step was an act of war. Maddox was waiting on the platform, playing the part of the town's righteous judge. "There she is," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cold. "The beggar bride and the fool who took on her shame. This is what weakness looks like, folks. A woman so desperate she has no dignity, and a man so soft he lets her drag him into the gutter with her." The crowd murmured, hungry for the drama. Annalise felt the old, familiar sickness of shame rising in her, but she pushed it down. She heard Wyatt Kane's voice in her head. "Stand." They stopped at the foot of the platform. The space between them and Maddox crackled with tension. "You've all seen it!" Maddox spread his arms wide. "The bread, the coat, the whispers in the dark. He's her keeper now, and if we allow this disgrace, what's left of decency in this town?" A few people nodded. The poison was working. Annalise could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the cold air like a razor. "You talk of lessons, Mr. Maddox," she said, her eyes locked on his. "Then tell them the whole truth. Tell them how a man's power can be built on nothing but the cruelty he shows to others. You speak of me as if I'm broken." She took a breath, and her voice grew stronger. "But I am still standing." A gasp went through the crowd. The beggar bride was talking back. Maddox's smile turned ugly. Brave words from a woman hiding behind a man's shadow. He turned his glare on Jed. "And what about you, Carver? Are you man enough to admit you've chained yourself to her shame?" The crowd held its breath, turning to Jed. The silent giant finally lifted his head, his eyes cold as the winter sky. "You call it shame to help someone who's hungry." Jed's voice was low, but it carried with the weight of stone. "You call it weakness to give a person warmth when the world is cold. If that's what you believe, Maddox, then it's not her disgrace you're seeing, it's your own." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. The certainty on their faces began to crack. Maddox's face contorted with rage. This wasn't how the show was supposed to go. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. But before he could move, another voice sliced through the tension. Maddox has had his say, Wyatt Kane said. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his white horse behind him, that bare chest defying the cold. Maybe it's time someone else was heard from. The crowd parted for him, a ripple of fear and curiosity spreading through them. Wyatt stepped forward, his dark eyes fixed on Maddox. I was there the day she arrived, Wyatt said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. I saw her fiancé get on the eastbound train, not 10 minutes before she got off the westbound. He looked like a man running from a ghost. He paused, letting the words sink in. Funny thing is, I saw him talking to you, Maddox, right before he left. Saw you hand him a thick envelope. A new murmur started in the crowd, a murmur of suspicion. Maddox's face went pale. That's a lie. You're a no-account drifter. Am I? Wyatt said. He looked past Maddox, his gaze finding Annalise. Miss Hartwell, did the man who courted you, Mr. Abernathy, ever mention owning land out here? Annalise's mind raced. No. He said he worked for the railroad. He did, Wyatt said, but his father didn't. His father owned the Silver Creek parcel, just north of town, the one with the only year-round water source for miles. Wyatt turned his gaze back to the crowd. Abernathy Sr. died last year. The land went to his son, and I'm guessing that land is exactly what our friend Mr. Maddox has been trying to get his hands on. The pieces started clicking into place, a terrible, ugly puzzle. You couldn't buy the land, Wyatt said, his voice dropping. So you decided to take the woman who came with it. You paid Abernathy to disappear, leaving her stranded here, helpless. You thought you could break her, shame her, until she was so desperate she'd have to turn to the generous Mr. Maddox for help. And the price of that help would have been her signature on a deed. The crowd was completely silent now, their eyes wide, staring at Maddox not as a leader, but as a monster. It wasn't about cruelty, Wyatt said, the final nail in the coffin. It was business. You weren't trying to teach her a lesson. You were trying to steal her inheritance. Maddox sputtered, his face a mask of fury and panic. You have no proof. Don't I? Wyatt reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Abernathy was a talker and a writer. He documented every meeting, every threat you made against his family back east if he didn't play along. He tossed the journal onto the platform at Maddox's feet. It's all in there. Maddox stared at the journal as if it were a coiled snake. The crowd started closing in, their faces no longer filled with judgment for Annalise, but with a cold, hard rage for the man who had played them all for fools. He was trapped. His own web of lies had become his cage. With a desperate snarl, he shoved his way through the stunned crowd and ran, his fine wool coat flapping behind him like the wings of a panicked crow. No one chased him. They just watched him go. His power, built on whispers and fear, had vanished into thin air. In the sudden, deafening silence, Annalise felt her knees tremble. Jed's hand found hers, his grip strong and steady. She had stood, and the truth had stood with her. The crowd began to disperse quietly, their eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. They were ashamed. The tide hadn't just shifted, it had receded, leaving Maddox's filth exposed for all to see. Jed turned to her, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched his lips. He didn't offer promises or vows. He didn't have to. He just held out his hand again. This time, she took it without hesitation. Together, they walked away from the station, away from the place where her shame had been born. The sun was higher now, its light warm on her face. She felt the weight of his coat on her shoulders, not as charity, but as a promise. She glanced back one last time. Wyatt Kane tipped his hat to her, a silent acknowledgement, before swinging onto his white horse and riding out of town, a ghost disappearing back into the wilderness. Annalise turned forward again, her hand held fast in Jed's. The snow was finally, truly melting, and in her chest, the small ember of defiance had grown into a steady, warming flame. The storm was over, and a new season, was about to begin. If you believe that one person's courage can change everything, and that justice will always find a way, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength we all have inside.